All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's library forum. I'm Janet Vogel, I'm the library director. Before I turn this over to Doug, who has what I think sounds like a very exciting presentation, I want to remind people of a couple of upcoming events. So tomorrow at noon, actually that's wrong. I think it's 12:30. Tomorrow at 12:30, learn how to use Mendeley's site. That was originally scheduled for the library lower level, but due to installation of technology down there, it will be up here. And I'll make sure to put signs up. I wasn't going to send an extra email, Jen, because I figured people could find it.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, that's fine. I didn't know until today that they needed tomorrow as well.
Got it.
So, and then don't forget, our next library forum is April 17th. Jim Kircher is going to speak about coincidence on the banks of the R. I don't know how you say that, A-A-R-E. So could be interesting, or should be interesting. It will be interesting. Jim will definitely make it interesting. And of course, don't forget all of our wonderful upcoming events. We have the Eclipse event coming up on April 8th. And so pay attention to Hiram College events so you can learn all about it. But now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Doug. Thank you so much for speaking about your sabbatical.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for taking the time and trouble during a Wednesday afternoon in week 11 to come over and have a back and forth here for a little bit. I know seating is at a premium, so grab your seat now because it's a full house, but each of you should get half a gallon of coffee because the ratios are quite good. So there's an upside to that. All right, nice to see you all. So I'm going today to talk to you about my sabbatical, which was a year-long sabbatical during the 2022 to 2023 academic year. And I will start off by saying that this was the first sabbatical I've ever had. I have taught between 25 and 30 academic years. And just the way things timed at different institutions meant that this was the first opportunity that I had to do this. And so I opted for the full year of complete poverty instead of the half year of partial poverty. And that was a good decision. I think it led both to some growth and enjoyment as well as some scholarly productivity. Now, a word on my sort of own approach to research projects, and I'll say more about this when I cite a couple of mentors from different phases of my career, but I've always been one to have 3 or 4 things kind of brewing or percolating at one time. And sometimes one makes it to the finish line sooner than I expected, and sometimes others fall back a bit due to all kinds of factors, but I always figure if I'm juggling a few things, then I'll be able to see one through to completion on a fairly regular basis. Better to keep one's options open with that sort of arrangement. I think it makes for flexibility. Now, why did I arrive at that approach? I think it's because, as I'll say in a little bit, I watched some academic mentors at the University of Maryland at College Park, at Georgetown Law School, as an undergraduate at the University of Iowa, and they modeled this sort of nimbleness or adaptability, and I thought if I could imitate that even to a partial degree, that would probably be a positive thing. So as you'll see when we get to the project stuff in just a little bit, I tried to identify a set of reading that I wanted to do that would have relevance and applicability to both of these projects, right? So that way, by doing one big set of reading, I could get both projects started and then move them along and put them into the mix with a couple others and sequence them. So here are a few people that I just want to mention who sort of demonstrated that this could be a productive approach to academic life. Ellis Hawley was a professor of mine at the University of Iowa as an undergraduate. There is one of his books early in his career, The Great War and the Search for a Modern Order, A History of the American People and Their Institutions, 1917 to 1933. At the University of Maryland at College Park, I was lucky to work with Roger Davidson, the 19th edition of whose textbook I am using this very term in my U.S. Congress class. His first big work in 1969 was the role of the congressman. Note that the gender language had not yet been adapted at that time, and went on to write a number of other things too, but was just, like Ellis, a very lovely person. And last but not least, and happily retired from the U.S. Naval Academy and still living, my department chair there, Stephen Franczyk, who among his, I think, 34 books or so, is Presidents in the Media, the Communicator-in-Chief, and that's one near the end of his run at the U.S. Naval Academy in 2018. All right, so to the projects themselves, the first project of focused investigation that I undertook was to do the research necessary to write a proposal for a journal that I'd like to start called the Journal of Engaged Ethics. I have in mind for this a quarterly publication, and I'd like it to be thematically arranged and contain about 7 peer-reviewed articles per issue 4 times a year. Not only have I sought to design this so that it would be something that scholars of different fields would find to be enjoyable and productive to read, but also that it would have appeal to a general readership, whether that is undergraduate students or the public at large. And so I want to sort of flesh out a bit what I have in mind for this. As I said, 5 to 7 portraits of individuals who work in a particular field, but also within a particular niche within the field in question. And so here are some examples for future issues of a journal of that kind. One can imagine taking the field of humanitarian relief and focusing on 5 to 7 figures who have been involved in famine relief around the world. And there could be unlikely suspects in that group of people who are usually not considered humanitarians. Take a Herbert Hoover, who fed Western Europe twice in his lifetime after wars and saved a great many people. Would he fall into that bucket as well as several potential others? I think he would. What about scientific innovation? Say 5 to 7 figures who have developed cancer treatments at different kinds of different types. Or legislative leadership. How have different U.S. House speakers moved particularly crucial bills to the trajectory of the Republic at important times? Say the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or the Affordable Care Act of 2010. And next example, law enforcement. What about groups started by individuals who have sought to liberate the wrongly incarcerated at different times in modern history? You can imagine that has been a very different leadership experience as technologies have changed and evolved, right? And last but not least, again, as an example, in terms of the field of military conflict, what about people who went out of their way to prevent atrocities by their own troops in a conflict in which they were engaged? Certainly My Lai comes to mind, but there are many others, not least of which a couple examples from the close of the Second World War in the Western European theater. Now, my aspiration for this publication is that it will describe each protagonist's personal system or code of ethics and how it informed that person's work across the individual's career, but also within the instance that we are talking about in this book. Now, I will say that I don't think most individuals, even individuals engaged in the kind of professional endeavors that we're talking about here, go on record often and say, you know, gosh darn it, I'm sure a Kantian. I'm that all right. But drawing from biographies and firsthand materials and a whole bunch of other publications, a scholar might, who's fascinated with one of these figures, take a particularly insightful crack at identifying what the code of ethics was that made that person tick. So here's an example, if I succeed at this, here's an example of what I'd like to end up with. This is a cover from a recent journal issue of the quarterly Human Rights Quarterly. This was founded in 1982 at the University of Maryland at College Park. Its journal publisher is Johns Hopkins University Press. It does this same kind of thing. Sometimes this is around the individuals who've worked in a particular subject matter area. Other times it focuses on an institution or a phenomenon or a conflict of one kind or another. But this became, in a short series of years, a journal that had risen from obscurity to be fairly well known, and it has gone on to win awards of different kinds. Now, why did I pick this journal as an example to sort of fold into my learning and my proposal writing and my preparation? Because this was young in its trajectory when I showed up for graduate school at the University of Maryland at College Park in August of 1990. And so I didn't even know it was a thing when I showed up. I had no idea, but there was the office for it, and there was Professor Richard Claude, whom I'll mention again in a moment. And it was an unexpected introduction to the labor on a daily and weekly basis and a quarterly basis for running a journal and what it entailed, and just how much management and outreach that task took. Now, the thing happily that's changed is that there's so many ways to manage the flow of manuscripts and information now that did not exist for poor Richard Claude, who was getting paper manuscripts mailed to his office at the University of Maryland at College Park in large numbers. But this journal remains an example of something that started with a fairly basic idea. It evolved in its focus areas and the concerns that it took on as issues evolved, and it went on to succeed. There's the late Richard Claude right there. He's at an American Political Science Association meeting in that picture, I think, in the last couple of years of his life, accepting an award for what he had done with certain issues of human rights quarterly. He wrote a great many books, one of which was that one, Science in the Service of Human Rights. You can imagine 22 years ago that he was writing about things that then were brand new and on an edge of what was coming down the pike. And it's regrettable that he didn't get to see what kinds of things would come after those and what kinds of issues of a journal he might produce in later times. Did I know that Richard Claude was a professor at the University of Maryland at College Park when I went there? I did not know that. I had no idea. I went there for other people and other purposes and other programs, but that was just a happenstance and a piece of good luck. Okay, I guess this slide's going to unfurl itself. I guess AI has decided for us that that is the way that's going to work. So I'm okay with that. I think that's fine. And apparently it'll go bullet by bullet. Didn't know that, didn't choose that, but that's okay. So what I did for the reading on this project, but also the reading that applies to the other project too, is that I sort of took up residence off campus at the Chagrin Falls Public Library. Some of you may have been there one time or another. It's really quite a lovely place. I became a regular, and I got to know the librarians and the other people there, and they kind of knew when I would come in and what I was up to and all of that kind of stuff, so I enjoyed that very much. Now let's see if... Oh, okay, there we go. Boy, that's slow by my lights. Okay. Among the many articles that I read was this one by Roshana Kamtekar, Situationism and Virtue Ethics on the Content of Our Character in the Journal Ethics. That is an article that Colin Anderson recommended to me before I went on sabbatical. It'll reappear here in just a little bit, and that's why I sort of plant the seed of that right now. Okay, let's see what's next. All right. It focused, among other things, on the idea of practical wisdom. So if one is predisposed to have or to exhibit a certain virtue, or if one is even committed to habituating it into one's life, that's all well and good, but it's no guarantee that one might know how and when and to what degree to use that virtue in a particular setting in professional or adult or personal family life. And so in thinking about the proposal for a journal of this kind, I wanted to make sure that people who are going to write pieces about individuals that would appear in an issue would have, and I'll say more about this in just a little bit, kind of a mini table of contents for the components of an article, what the word length is, and one of those sections will be on how that person with a particular code or standard set of ethics, behaviors, and beliefs came to have some wisdom in demonstrating a virtue or in tackling a problem. And for my field of presidential studies, I think that I have in mind a person like Abraham Lincoln who just learned from the muck and the dross of life and interacting with a great many people during the middle portion of his adulthood, From the time that he was in New Salem and on into Springfield, he interacted with every kind of person imaginable. He learned how to get along with people. He was put in a great variety of practical situations, some of which are pretty fascinating. And so this is the kind of thing, practical wisdom, that I want to figure large in these sketches that people write for an issue of a journal of this kind. Now, slight aside, and I don't think it's a bullet on the slide, what I was surprised to run into in some of the articles that I read was that there is a desire, such a desire for systematization in the study of ethics, as there can be in the social sciences, that people wanted to make this formulaic and even do statistical measurement, and all of that does not seem to me terribly productive. I think one is better to have a grown-up and sophisticated discussion of one's path to practical wisdom, and I think that's also the kind of thing that appeals rather to a general readership far more than a regression about Abraham Lincoln's experiences, for example. Okay. So let's talk about the second project of focused investigation here. So the idea that I have in mind here is a proposal for a book that goes under the working title of Virtuous Presidents. And what I would like to do is to sort of fit closely, insofar as it can be done, presidents with particular virtues who best embodied the virtue in question, and then pursue how did this affect their navigation of the political system, their leadership on particular issues? What problems did being an exerciser of that virtue cause, in addition to having positive aspects to it as well? Here again, my thought is that something like this should be crafted for a general readership. It should be appealing not only to people who happen to be teachers or academics, but that it should have some appeal to undergraduate students or graduate students or the public at large or people who like history and all of those kinds of things. So here is an idea that has some appeal to me. One can imagine taking the four cardinal virtues, as they're most often identified, and having a president matched up with each of those and then demonstrating how that person came to have that through the experiences of life, not just to have a predisposition toward it, but how to use it effectively or well or wisely, and then limn the implications of being matched in that virtue or with that virtue. There might be another section that would be on intellectual virtues: honesty, curiosity, open-mindedness, perseverance, and charity, right? Here again, the reading that I did on the practical wisdom concept is important and is relevant. Now, one thing that I've given a lot of thought to in my reading is, well, how exactly might one match a particular president with a particular virtue? I think there are some standouts. It couldn't hurt if your name is Honest Abe, I suppose, to be paired with honesty. But Lincoln has so many virtues that are exceptional that to me is not a lock cinch. That may not be an automatic thing. All right, so here is an idea that I have had, and we'll see in the next slide or so why I have come to have this idea. And that is perhaps to use a survey of the Presidents and Executive Politics section of the American Political Science Association, and to have a great many people who study the presidency just start by having some raw data and feedback on which presidents most possessed which virtues. All right, where did I get that idea? I got that idea because about the time of President's Day in February, I was one of 155 scholars in the United States who filled out the 2024 Presidential Greatness Project Expert Survey. There were 555 or so people who are in this section of the APSA. This is done every few years by these two professors, Professor Brandon Rottinghouse at the University of Houston and Justin S. Vaughn, who is at Carolina Coastal University. Although I think Professor Vaughn has just moved to the University of Houston, so I think they are now located in the same department. But they were in charge of carrying out this survey both in 2015 and in 2018. I was invited to participate in the 2018 one, so this is the second time that I've done that. There's the little mini tile headline from the New York Times when it came out. It was in all of the newspapers. Happily, President Trump finished dead last again, as he did in 2018. I don't ever anticipate that that will change in one iota. If there's a republic left, that ranking will be fixed exactly where it's fixed. I hope my point is getting across. So I thought what I might do is I might devise a questionnaire, send it out to those 550 people, and then you can allow for qualitative feedback as well as check the box and numerical ratings. And it would give me not only perhaps in some cases reinforcement of suspicions, but it also might flag for me instances that I haven't thought about yet that could make a great deal of sense. Because have I gone out of my way to study the virtues of Rutherford B. Hayes as much as certain other prominent presidents? No, I have not done that, but there are people who have done that, and they might have a plausible and worthwhile case to make for a particular president in a particular instance. So, to be determined, but I think that might not be an unuseful thing to do. In thinking ahead to this book, and what it might be like to carry it off over a period of time, I think of the experiences of this fellow, who is happily still alive. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He was a professor of mine at the University of Iowa when I was City. He was a professor of journalism, but his main interests were in the American founding and the politics of the early American Republic. When I had him in several journalism classes over a period of about a year and a half at the University of Iowa, he was working on that book that is named there, Franklin and Bache, Envisioning the Enlightened Republic. It's about Benjamin Franklin and his grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bache, the famous publisher, and they both probably established more assertively in the public square of journalism the tenets of Jeffersonian republicanism than any other publishers of that time. But I remember him balancing the different parts of his professional life and also a family and a kid outside of work. And I remember the class coming in one day and somebody said, hey, Professor Smith, how did your work on the book go yesterday? And he said, and he kind of perked up and he looked at everyone and he said, I killed Bache. And he was very pleased because that wrapped up a chapter and he was on to the next. So it was just a kind of object lesson in the reality of navigating the things that all of us navigate in our professional lives with our different responsibilities. Okay, so what about the gift of time to read for this project? Here is a short list of some of the works that I read at the Chagrin Falls Library during that year. Unsurprisingly, they are all focused on virtues in one way or another. I particularly enjoyed the Boyd and Timpey volume. That to me was the one that had most practical impact and most practical use for my way of thinking about both of these projects. At the bottom of the list there, you will see that for some presidents, what I have in mind for both the book and a journal maybe are things that there are people out there who are perfectly well set and capable of writing an article or a journal piece going in. And William Lee Miller would be an example of that. He's written an ethical biography of Abraham Lincoln. And so I picked that up and I took time to read that too. And I think he would be the person on whom you'd want to call if you were trying to request a piece for a journal on Abraham Lincoln and a virtue. Okay, slight aside or disquisition here. So I guess I didn't appreciate how AI likes to suggest imagery for PowerPoint right now. And I went about 20 deep for this one. It kept wanting me literally to have someone knocking on a door, which to me was heavy-handed, call me crazy. So I went for something more like dropping out of the sky. Which I thought, maybe took an extra 90 seconds or something like that when I put the slide together, but there it is. Anyway, during the sabbatical year, Michael Ranella, who is the political science editor at SUNY Press, approached two co-editors of mine and me. We've done a series of about 4 books for SUNY, or 5, I guess, over the years. That's Robert Watson of Lynn University in Florida and Tom Lansford of the University of Southern Mississippi. And he said, we really don't have much on the Trump presidency yet. We have not really done one. Why don't you put in a proposal and let's see where that goes? And so we said, sure, let's do that. So we created a full proposal and we sent it to SUNY and they had it reviewed, and then that proposal was accepted. And there is its title: The Trump Term: Scholars Assess Its Unprecedented Impact on the American Presidency and the Future of the Republic. That is to be published in 2025. We have about 5 chapters in there. You'll see more of this in just a minute. There are 22 chapters altogether. But it is explicitly, for people who signed up for the project going in, a critical volume. It is people with standing in the field of political science, presidential studies, and American history. And we reached out to people whose perspectives we were aware of. Now, a word about contingency plans. What if there's a second Trump term? Okay, that's one real looming possible contingency. So we've had that discussion with Michael Ranella, and he said, we'll just put a first in the title, and then we'll see if you want to put in a proposal for a second. For a whole host of reasons, let us all hope that that will not become a necessity. But all of those chapters will be in the early part of the summer, and the manuscript will be off to the press in August, and then we wait until Election Day. And either it goes like that, or we jigger a couple things around, and then we publish it, and then we look to a successor volume. I've never less wanted a successor volume to anything in my life. Okay, now, so what about some additional purposes to my approach to this project? Okay, this particular project, the SUNY project. Both Tom and Robert said to me, look, you should go ahead and take the lead, and you should slot the authors into the chapters for this project. And I think they did that for a couple of reasons. A, they are exceedingly busy scholars, and they are far more productive as human beings and teachers and scholars than I could ever be. But they had a lot on their plates. But number two, without saying so much, they were kind of like, hey, maybe we need to pass things to someone who's half a generation younger than we are, and we need to kind of begin to pass down the chain a bit. So I took them up on that particular challenge, and I appreciated it being offered to me. And so here are some of the things that I sought to do and that I think I have been encouraged at maybe having pulled off in the putting together of this volume. The first is that I wanted to invite people whose work I admired and whose work would pave the way for a whole wide range of partnerships for future publications and conferences and the like. My experience is that once you publish something with a large number of authors, over time someone else reaches back to you when they have another project someday and they want to involve you. And so now here are another 30 or so authors, because some of the chapters are dual authored chapters. Presidential studies, I don't think it would come as any shock, has sort of been like an old guy's field, okay? It's kind of like what it's been. And so I wanted to bring the average age in this volume down quite a bit, and I wanted to contribute in a way to the diversification of the professoriate in the field of presidential studies. And we'll give you some examples here in just a moment. But the lesson that has been reinforced through this experience, and I'll say more about this on a different slide, is that I just took a blank slate and I went, who would I want to write this chapter? Never mind if I'm not good enough or if I am not anyone they've ever heard of in their life, but who would I want to author this chapter? And you know what? I'm not going to be bashful. I'm going to reach out and I'm going to send my CV and a very nice email, and I'm going to see what happens. And what I found was invariably only 2 things happened. Somebody either said, you know what, I'll do this. Or they said, I don't think I can do this, but I'll tell you who can. And that was just as good in almost all those cases. Now, there are probably a dozen people here that I would not otherwise have worked with that I'll now have the chance to work with, and I think that's probably all for the better. Okay, so in swinging big on who would do what chapters here, the opening chapter is called Donald J. Trump, American Demagogue, and it is authored by 3 people. Mark Graber, who is one of only 5 University of Maryland professors at the law school, Jack Balkin of Yale, and Sanford Levinson of UT Austin Law School. So they're going to take that on, and that is to explain in very clear, penetrable language why Donald Trump is the thing that the framers most feared, who could knock down norms and institutions and ride away with the Republicans, steal it right from under our eyes, and it would just collapse, and the American people would more or less consent. Robert Watson has chapter 2 as the person speaking for the editors. I have my own chapter that I'm authoring on my own, but then he gets into presidential studies more formally and does an overview of the Trump presidency. But I particularly wanted to highlight these chapters and say a word about them. So the turbulent vice presidency of Mike Pence, these are all working titles, will be done by Christopher Devine of the University of Dayton. So there's a fairly young scholar of the vice presidency. That is a niche within presidential studies, who is working with a very young scholar from Sherbrooke University in Quebec, and that is Karine Prémont. So I like the international angle on that too. And I like the idea that there's somebody in Canada who is a scholar of the American vice presidency, which I would not necessarily have predicted. Second, Michael Genovese at Loyola Marymount University is near the end of his career here, but a kind of a giant in the field and just a darn good scholar and human being, and he'll do the chapter on alternative facts and attacks on fake news. Chapter 12 was one of those instances where I never thought somebody would say yes, and that was Andrew Gillespie at Emory University. Her book is out, and if you've not read it, you should. It is on the Obama presidency and race. And so she is a scholar of race in American history and politics, and she said yes, but in the spirit of the volume, she reached out to an even younger professor at Ohio Wesleyan University, Brianna Mack, and they're going to co-author that chapter together. From Lehigh University, Michael Gusmano. Nobody's written more about health policy over the last 20 years in political science journals than Michael. Chapter 19th, Elizabeth Bomberg of the University of Edinburgh is going to do that chapter. Hopefully there could be a conference at Edinburgh University at some point. That'd be dandy. That would just be a wonderful thing if we could find a way to do that. She's writing on climate agreements. Last, just by way of example, the president of New England College, Wayne L'Esperance, has agreed to do the big lie in the January 6th assault on the electoral system. So all 23 chapters are assigned, and they either have an author or one or two, or in the first case, the first chapter, there are 3, but that volume is going to be just about done by the time we get to the end of June, and then it'll be prepared and head to SUNY. Okay, so last slide here, I want to focus on a couple of things that are not academic as such, particularly. So sometimes sequencing in life can work out in ways that you did not anticipate. There's my parents, as of today, married 70 years and 12 days, right there today. And we had to move them into assisted living during that year. So we had to sell our house, we had to get rid of all our possessions. I'm sorry. That took a lot. But could I have done it were I not on a sabbatical year? I don't know how in the hell I would have done it, honestly. I don't know how I would have done that. But there it is. It worked out. And they're hanging in there okay. I also had 4 months of real health problems during that period of time. And I'm okay now. But for a period of time, it did not look like I would be okay. And I found myself thinking during those 4 months, what would have happened if I were not on a sabbatical right now? Would I be teaching a class? And I came to the conclusion, I would not. There's no way I would be teaching a class. I could not possibly teach classes. So one does not ask for certain things to happen at certain times, but when they do, this is one of the rare instances where the timing was as good as it perhaps possibly could have been. So those by way of sort of side emphases. Last thing I will say is I wanted to do some traveling during that year, and I sequenced that for September and October for the most part, and I did it and got out of the way, and then I got sick. And all I could think of during the time I was sick was, I'm glad that I did that then. Otherwise, it would not have happened. It never would have happened. So maybe that is one of those small, fortuitous, good little lucky breaks that took place during the course of the year as well. Okay, I think, yeah, that is it. So I will, I will open it up for whatever kind of things you'd like to talk about or whatever kind of questions you have, and we can bash those around here for a little bit. Yes.
Sorry to ask you about something that you have not done, but I'm curious. So your idea for your book, Virtuous Presidents.
Yes.
Have you ever considered writing a book about vicious presidents?
Well, so my mind has gone there in many ways, right? And so I think of virtues having excesses and deficiencies, right? Which is the notion of the whole set of virtues from the very beginning. And I think it's fascinating to think about presidents who were either not courageous but foolhardy or cowardly, right? And etc. all the way through the set of virtues. So I think it could be very interesting to look at those who most needed a particular virtue at a given time, but could not offer it up and did not possess it. So yeah, absolutely. I think that could be very interesting. Nick.
I'm just curious, having followed a lot of your travels on Facebook. I know that you did a number of your trips with your daughter.
Yeah.
And I was curious how that travel with a girl moving into young adulthood affected your perception of your status. Did it change something how you saw things?
Very much so. I liked the opportunity to show her particular parts of the country at a time in her life when she is receptive and open to the possibilities of all the directions life could go, right? Not just heading off to college, but all the decades, right, that will come after that. And not to overemphasize the personal, but I will just say we interact now as a young adult and an old adult, right? I feel very fortunate about that. We speak to each other as adults, and she's a very boom companion on those trips. My parents, I think, came from a very constrained frame of reference from small towns in rural Iowa in the Great Depression, and one did not run off to see the sequoias, shall we say, very much, okay? And so I'm glad that stars have aligned in a way that I have things in mind, and if I throw her 5 ideas and say, is there one of those that we could go see for 7 days, she'll look at them and go research them, and then say, well, what about that one? Let's go do that. Or I don't want to do any of them. I've got one for you, right? So that was a delight and a real a balm across those travels. Michelle.
Do you have advice for those of us that may be getting a sabbatical soon? I wanted to know if you took a whole year.
I did.
If there are things that maybe you wish that you had done differently. I mean, a lot of cool serendipitous things happen, but any suggestions?
Have a plan. Eisenhower said that plans are worthless, but planning is everything, right? A plan can always morph and change in light of circumstances. I'm glad I had a plan. Don't get sick. Don't do that. But also, we work pretty hard here in my experience of a faculty. And so once in a while, do something that is worth it for its own sake, that is not just a plank in your plan. Do that once in a while too. I think it'll make you a better person and a happier person, as opposed to someone who completely fulfilled your self-expectation on work projects. I don't know if any of that helps at all.
Did you end up taking a full year?
I did. Yes, I did do that. I think that was the good choice, particularly in light of the complications that arose there. I think that turned out to be just pure luck, but I'm glad that it worked that way. I, even when in full health and not doing other family things, I felt that I could use the time and use the time productively. I was not at a lack of work to do. Let's put it that way. Kim?
So I appreciated that as you were thinking about the scholars to work with on your book, that you really thought about diversity. Did you offer some of the younger scholars any particular direction or advice as they were thinking about the project, or did you leave that, many of them were partnered with co-authors, did you kind of leave them on their own, or how did you work with them to help them feel more confident?
That's a great question. It's a little bit of both, and I felt in some instances a partnership was probably prudent and would be very helpful. I did that sometimes early in writing, and I thought that was very valuable. But contrastingly, there's an author named Austin Trantham from St. Leo University who has contributed a chapter. I would reckon, I don't know, but I would reckon he's probably 30 or 28 or something and has not had a PhD for more than a year and a half or 2 years maybe. And I was at the Southern Political Science Association conference, and I said, I looked at a couple of your articles. You feel like you could write this chapter, Austin? He goes, I don't know if I don't know if I'm ready. I don't know. I was like, I'm sure you're ready. I think you can do that. I have no doubt that he'll put in a great product, and it'll be good for the volume, but also a good thing for him as a scholar, I think, too. Yeah. Mark. And over to Don.
So what are the prospects for your journal idea? What does it take to make something like that happen?
So it takes an exceedingly detailed proposal, and then it takes vetting and figuring out which of the potential publishers really makes sense for your journal. And I've kind of, by and large, deferred to Robert Watson's judgment. He started the journal Lighthouse Studies. But I am not done with that proposal, and I won't be done with that proposal until summer. On the one hand, I feel sheepish saying that. On the other hand, I feel maybe that given all that has transpired, that's not the worst thing in the world. But by having 4 plates in the air, all the plates will get delivered. They'll just get delivered at different times. Don?
I have 2 questions. One, is Professor Hawley related to the Terra Paula?
I don't know.
The second is your journal. It sounds fascinating, but it's got very specific focus on a very specific kind of article. Are you concerned with being able to get enough submissions, particularly early on when the journal doesn't have a big reputation yet?
So I would say, no, I'm not, and here's why. If I were to say work with Erin Lamb at Case, I think she could identify a suite of authors on various themes, and the idea would be to have 5 years of things in the can and moving through the pipeline before any first issue is published. That, I think, is prudent with a journal, and this is not a time-sensitive set of things that have to change and roll in response to current events, political and otherwise. So I can imagine doing it that way so that you have one of every year's 4 products through someone like Erin and another set for the first several years through someone else. So I'm actually not as worried about that perhaps as one might wager, I guess. Yeah.
So have you thought about maybe, or would you be open to, in that journal, including materials on ethics run amok? I'm thinking of Anthony Comstock.
Oh, yes, sure.
And something, people that maybe today we would not look upon as ethical or as virtuous really, but he thought he was.
Yeah.
And maybe some of his victims, people who got thrown in prison.
Yeah, so what comes to mind right away is 5 to 7 of those people from different times in American history who have foisted a moralistic agenda on the American people through one or another ways. In his case, we know what that entailed. And then the question is, why did they come to have this sensibility about what was ethical or not? And why did they try to go out and enact it upon people too? I think that could be very interesting. And this is not, this is historical, but it has a broad play over maybe even a couple of centuries or more. So,
yeah. The long arm of Anthony Comstock is now still reaching out. We heard his name
at the Supreme Court.
Right?
Exactly right. Yes, even though it hasn't been used in, 100 years or something like that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great idea, Viv. Yes. Perhaps I could enlist you in a chapter in one piece. How about that? That would be good. Yes.
I was curious what you found like your most interesting, of all your readings on like virtue ethics and practical wisdom and that stuff, what was like the most interesting thing that you learned or came out of that?
So I did not realize that there were and are scholars who wish to align things in a perfect, orderly chart the same way that social scientists are tempted to do that. And at some point, they're arguing over precision that can't be gotten because these are human beings and these are their lives and these are their beliefs and their practices. And what is n in such an instance to count anyway, right? What is it exactly that you would count? So I found that I did not have any idea of that. This was not a thing I'd run into ever. So I found that to be very interesting. I probably have an inbuilt bias from my time in the two course sequence in graduate school on methods and those things that I see in political science. Those things can be used quite profitably on certain things, but they can be used and misused and made to be unprofitable on other things in political science. But I think for studying the ethics of a human being, I don't wish to have such systemization and such precision. I think it is better to talk through the ideas in question and the cause and effect and have an account and conversation about a human life rather than something that's terribly formal about a human life, I guess. Mark.
Okay, so in your non-academic part of the sabbatical, your travels, what was your favorite travel destination?
I guess I probably have an appreciation for the Four Corners area of the desert Southwest and the whole Colorado Plateau and Utah, and made it right to the edge of Monument Valley on that trip, and there it is, it's beckoning, but that has to be another trip. Much of Utah has to be another trip in its own right. But I guess the whole desert Southwest, I've always been a devotee of the American West, but particularly now the Southwest, I think, is very high up there and could be a place to live, I think, too.
One of my favorite areas of
Yeah.
the country is that desolate desert landscapes.
Well, that's really cool.
Lots of great rocks out there, too.
Yeah, geology, heaven. I will say one thing I did, and I guess I should have put this in here. What I did is I made a list of people I'd known from different times in my life who I always thought I'd like to travel with that person. And then I just started to invite people. And you know what? Turns out, if you think somebody's fun and you'd like to travel with them and you invite them, most of the time they'll go, yes, I like that. Let's go travel somewhere. So that was kind of neat, too. And I would like to do more of that as well. Yeah. All right, thanks a bunch, guys. I enjoyed
The
that.
librarian has to
Oh,
ask.
yes. Yeah.
So I know you like the Chagrin Falls Library, but I know you also spend a lot of time in this library. What's your favorite place to work in this library?
So let me talk about that for a minute. I love this library. I just love it. And I've always loved it since I've been here. But by spending my days here in stretches, I came to appreciate it more. On the second floor, I like two of the study rooms that are over toward that end of the building. And I like the one that's on the corner out toward the post office.
Yeah.
I love that one. I also like the one that is down this side that is the first one on the side. I like that one too. And I like the opportunity to be able to open your window and have a breeze come through. If it's too hot or too cold, you can moderate your temperature, and to just let the day pass and have a coffee and have your word processor there and just work the day away. I have loved those days. I did one of those a couple days ago, in fact, here. But this library, under, by the way, your time as the person in charge of it, has become prettier, and it has become more functional, and it has become a bigger resource for the campus community. And I think had you not been the person who has that job, I don't think those things would have happened, Janet. So thank you for that. All right, thanks a bunch, guys. That was fun. Have a good day. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I'll just put up the slide to take the survey, if you wouldn't mind. This is related to, of course, our grant to update the library lower level. The technology is being installed this week, so that's very exciting. So please do take our survey to help us say we did things for the grant.